There's something inherently unsettling about the combination of darkness, rain, and isolation. The rhythmic sound of rain falling can be soothing until it's not. When the rain comes in torrents, beating down on windows, it can drown out all other noises, making the silence around you seem even heavier. But what if, within that silence, you begin to hear something you shouldn't? Something sinister that lurks in the shadows, just out of view. These true creepy stories come from people who experienced terrifying events, all while the rain fell relentlessly around them. They are a chilling reminder that sometimes the things you can't see or hear clearly can be the most dangerous. Story 1: A lonely night in the woods. Emily had always loved hiking alone. There was something peaceful about being in nature, disconnected from the chaos of the world. One autumn weekend, she decided to hike in a remote part of the forest near her small cabin in the woods. It had been a long week, and she needed to clear her mind. The weather forecast predicted rain later in the evening, but Emily wasn't worried. She loved the rain and the way it made everything feel more intimate and alive. She set off in the early afternoon, enjoying the quiet, crisp air, the gentle sound of leaves rustling underfoot. But by the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the clouds had thickened, and rain began to fall steadily. The steady drizzle gradually turned into a downpour. She pulled her hood tighter around her face and quickened her pace, hoping to reach a small clearing she had passed earlier. The rain, combined with the darkness, created a blanket of isolation. Emily was now completely alone, save for the occasional bird call or rustle in the underbrush. Or so she thought. As the rain fell harder, Emily began to hear something unusual. It wasn't the normal noise of the forest, no. This was something more deliberate. A soft, whispering sound, like a voice trying to be heard through the rain. At first, she brushed it off as the wind or the sounds of water rushing in the nearby creek. But the whispers grew louder, clearer, and more distinct. Emily. Her heart skipped a beat. The voice was too clear to be the wind or some animal. It was calling her name. She froze. It sounded like it was coming from the direction of the clearing she had been heading toward. But she hadn't seen anyone when she passed that way. The only sound now was the torrential rain crashing against the leaves. She hesitated but continued walking toward the clearing, her breath growing shallow with each step. The whispers came again, but this time they were closer, more urgent. Emily, come closer. Chilled to the bone, she picked up the pace, her feet slipping on the slick mud. Then, as she neared the clearing, the rain seemed to stop altogether, and an eerie silence enveloped her. She stood there for a moment, barely breathing, as the darkness seemed to press in around her. The whispers faded, leaving her with an unsettling stillness. Suddenly, a cold gust of wind swept through the trees, and she heard it again this time. It was not a whisper, but a voice, loud and clear, directly behind her. Turn around. Emily spun around, her heart pounding in her chest. But the clearing was empty. There was no one there. The rain began to fall harder, and she ran back to her cabin, her legs shaking beneath her. She never went back to that spot in the woods, and every time she heard the rain fall heavily on the roof, she couldn't help but remember the voice calling her, whispering her name from the darkness. Story 2: A strange visitor in the storm. Mark had always been a skeptic. He didn't believe in ghosts or the supernatural, no matter how many people told him about their creepy encounters. He chalked up strange noises to the wind, shadows to the play of light, and uneasy feelings to overactive imaginations. But one stormy night in his new apartment changed all of that. It was late, well past midnight, and Mark was curled up on the couch, watching a late-night movie. Outside, the rain pounded against his windows, and thunder rumbled in the distance. He had only recently moved into the apartment, a small, older building in a quiet neighborhood, and he was still getting used to the creaks and groans of the place as it settled. Suddenly, the sound of a loud knock on his door jolted him out of his thoughts. 3 sharp raps. Mark froze, glancing at the clock. Who could be knocking at this hour? The rain was coming down in sheets, and the wind howled through the cracks in the walls. He hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to answer it. Maybe it was a neighbor in distress, or perhaps someone trying to escape the storm. He made his way to the door, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease creeping up his spine. He peered through the peephole, expecting to see someone soaked to the bone, but saw nothing. His breath hitched in his chest. There was no one standing on the other side. Still, he cautiously opened the door, half expecting to find an empty hallway. But there, just outside, was a woman. She stood in the rain, drenched from head to toe, her face obscured by a dark, soaked hood. "Can I help you?" Mark asked, his voice trembling slightly. The woman didn't respond. Instead, she slowly raised her head, and he could see her eyes wide, unblinking and eerily vacant. Her lips didn't move, but the sound of a whisper filled the air between them. "Let me in." Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he looked into her cold, empty eyes. Something in the air felt wrong, like the temperature had dropped several degrees, and the rain seemed to intensify, creating an almost otherworldly silence. Despite the urge to slam the door shut, he found himself stepping back, his hand trembling as he reached for the doorknob. As he did, the woman vanished. No flash of movement, no rustle of fabric, just gone. Mark stood in the doorway, his pulse racing, staring at the now empty space. His head swam with confusion, and for a moment, he considered that he might have imagined it. But then, as the storm raged on outside, a faint whisper seemed to fill the air coming from inside his apartment. "Let me in." Mark slammed the door shut and bolted it, locking all the windows and doors. For the rest of the night, the wind howled, and the rain pounded against his walls, but he never heard that knock again. He moved out a few weeks later, unable to shake the sense that something or someone had wanted to get inside. Story 3: A Visit in the Night. Jack had always prided himself on his logical mind. A skeptic to the core, he had never believed in paranormal activity, dismissing it as superstition or overactive imaginations. So when he moved into his new apartment in a historic building in the city, he had no reason to suspect anything out of the ordinary. The building itself was beautiful, old, but well-maintained, with high ceilings, vintage woodwork, and tall windows. It was perfect for Jack. He quickly settled in, enjoying the peacefulness of his new place. But there was one thing that made him uneasy: the strange noises at night. At first, he thought it was just the building settling, the usual creaks and groans that come with age. But then, over the course of several weeks, he started hearing something else, something more distinct. It was a sound that seemed to come from the hallway outside his apartment, just beyond the door. Faint footsteps, soft whispers, and occasional knocking. One rainy night, Jack woke up to the sound of those same footsteps. It was well past midnight, and the rain was coming down in sheets. He lay in bed, listening to the rhythmic sound of the rain hitting the window, trying to ignore the creeping sensation that he wasn't alone. The footsteps continued, growing louder, closer. He sat up in bed, straining his ears, but it was as if the sound was coming from inside his apartment. The floor creaked outside his bedroom door, and Jack's blood ran cold. "Hello," he called out, his voice barely above a whisper. There was no response, just the sound of rain pouring outside. But then, the footsteps stopped. The silence was suffocating. Jack slowly stood up, his heart pounding in his chest. He walked to the door and carefully opened it, peering into the dim hallway. There was no one there, only the faint echo of the rain against the window and the soft creaking of the old building. Relieved, he stepped back into his apartment, but just as he turned to close the door, a cold wind blew past him despite all the windows being closed. Suddenly, he felt something behind him. A presence. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end as the temperature in the room dropped. He turned around slowly, but there was nothing there. Yet the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. As the rain continued to fall, Jack could hear a low whisper coming from the corner of the room.